Boston Harbor Islands adventure, the Great Brewster Journal of 1891. Just please be sure to silence all your phones. Adventure back to 1891 and the Boston Harbor Islands as the Friends of the Boston Harbor Islands bring history to life. Our guide for this evening will be historian and author Marguerite Krupp. In 1891, four intrepid women from Lowell sailed to a remote island in Boston Harbor for a 16-day escape from New England's prim and proper society. Calling themselves the scribe, the aristocrat, the acrobat, and the autocrat, the women rusticated in a cottage on Great Brewster Island, reveling in the chance to shed their identities of wife, mother, and daughter. Relive their sojourn through their remarkable journal filled with observations, illustrations, photographs, and poetry. Marguerite Krupp is a longtime volunteer with the Friends of the Boston Harbor Islands, including 2 summers volunteering on Great Brewster Island. Her specialties include island birds and other critters, plants, history, and teaching people how to make a whistle out of a periwinkle shell. Margarita is a writer, editor, teacher, photographer, and a great storyteller, and we welcome you tonight.
Thank you very much. You're fine. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's not as warm as it was the day that the travelers went out to Great Brewster, but this is a presentation of the journal that they kept, and the journal, the entire journal, is enclosed in this book, which we're selling tonight at a discounted price, so if you'd care to buy a copy, that's fine. I also have over there, for anyone who's interested, maps of Boston Harbor. 3 maps thanks to the National Park Service. And they're over on the table over there, and some information about the Friends of the Boston Harbor Islands. Okay, so much for the commercial. I'm just delighted to be here too. It's one of those things where this whole program really sort of became, the book and the project came about sort of by accident. And the thing was, and I'll get to it in the program here, if I can use my glasses to get my, there we are. A little bit about the project. A team of about 10, sometimes 12, sometimes 8, got together during the pandemic over Zoom. Most of us were members of the Friends of the Boston Harbor Islands, and some of us were had various specialties. Probably work better if I turn the microphone on. So we were fortunate to have, thank you, a historian from Lowell, and we were actually had a couple of college professors and various other people contributing to the project, and we didn't kill each other, which is very good too. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we decided to tackle this project, a little bit about the background of the Boston Harbor Islands and Lowell, and I'll take a look at the journal. What we had to start with was a photocopy of the original journal. And you can get a feeling for the fact you can't read a blessed thing in it. That's what it really comes down to. So it was open to a lot of interpretation, but at least you had a chance to see what the women themselves had written. And mercifully, the entire journal, as I said before, the handwritten journal, and the illustrations that the women themselves put in are included in the book. So it makes it a lot easier because it's all transcribed into TypeScript, which is much easier to read. Okay, so we're going to look at the journal and look what is in it and what's not in it. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how we set up our research process, what we found, who these women were, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as to why we had to figure out who they were, the photography techniques that they used, remembering that this is 1891, when amateur photography is just getting started. They had just, Kodak, George Eastman had just invented the amateur photography camera about 2 years earlier, and they were fairly rare. We'll talk a little bit about the details of the fashion, food, and reading material that they had. And I apologize, my Victorian costume doesn't fit anymore. We talked a little bit about the vision for the book and some additional research and some questions that you might want to propose. We funded this project through the Friends of the Boston Harbor Islands. They had come up with the money to convince the History Press to produce it for us. And as a matter of fact, Friends of the Boston Harbor Islands were very involved in putting this thing together. And we're also part of Boston Harbor Now, which is one of the primary agencies helping things happen in Boston Harbor. This is a little bit of the geography. We have the whole of Boston Harbor as illustrated in the map. Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
Can you still see?
Okay, yeah. Okay, so anyway, Great Brewster Island is part of the National and State Historical Park in Boston Harbor. It consists of 34 islands and peninsulas, some of which disappear at a high tide. The season for getting out there by ferry just ended last weekend, but you can find a road, you can get to some of the areas, the peninsulas in particular, Deer Island, F.W. Webb's State Park, and World's End down in Hingham by car year-round, and they're well worth it. There is a small parking fee at World's End for the trustees, but it's well worth going. So, it's Great Brewster is the largest of the grouping of the Brewster Islands. They're named after Elder William Brewster. And here's Great Brewster. And over here is Little Brewster, which is where Boston Light is. I'd like to know how many people have been out to the Boston Harbor Islands? Quite a few. That's great. And I hope to welcome the rest of you out there some other time. Next summer, that would be great. We also sponsor, Friends of the Harbor Islands also sponsors a trip around the harbor, sometimes to Thompson's Island, the 1st of January. For the brave souls who want to go. Yeah. Okay. I've been out there many times the 1st of January. It's really pretty exciting. Okay. The Brewster Islands are about 9 miles out from the city of Boston. Now, this is a map of the harbor about the time that the women were out there. The squiggly lines around the islands indicate the depth of the water. So the darker the line, the deeper the water, the shallower the water. And you can see that spreading out, that if you wanted to take a boat out there, you would have to be pretty careful most of the time. And that's one of the reasons why you have Boston Light out there, because they were losing cargoes and so forth, and people, as they tried to come into the harbor. Surrounding the lighthouse, over here is Hull. It's about a mile from Boston Light to Hull. There's a cable that runs between the two that's about a mile long. runs the light for Boston Light. So when they were out there at Great Brewster, they were over here, and Boston Light is here. This comes in later when you see that you could actually get from one to the other. The story of how this journal came to our attention was that this gentleman, Professor John Stilgoe from Harvard, was riding his bike up on the North Shore one time, and he got a flat tire, fortuitously right in front of a used bookstore. If you got to have a flat tire, you know. So he went in, and he saw the proprietor, who was busily going through this journal, ripping out the pages because he wanted to sell the photographs on eBay. So Professor Stilgoe came in and said, "Don't do that!" And he, startled the guy, and he showed him his credit card, and he said, "Please, I'll give you my credit card to hold it, but I'm going to try to get Harvard to buy it." And curiously enough, Harvard did. And it is now in the collection of the Schlesinger Library at Harvard. This is where it is. This is what it looks like now. The pencil is just there for scale, okay? And you'll be seeing better views of this later on. But by appointment, you can actually see the journal itself. Well, Stephanie Shiro, who was a newspaper writer, discovered this journal in the Schlesinger one day, and she got very fascinated by it, and she wrote an article about it and published it in the Boston Globe. And in 2008, she just put this thing together. Well, then she showed it to Suzanne Gallmarsh, who is the founder of the Friends of the Boston Harbor Islands. And Suzanne got excited about it. And she said, "We've got to do something about getting this out there." So time went by, and they put out a message on the Friends of the Boston Harbor Islands email list and said, "Would anybody be interested in working on this project?" So of course I went, "Yes!" immediately. So did a bunch of other people. And because we were in the middle of the pandemic, we couldn't meet directly. We did a lot of emails back and forth, but we also used Zoom a lot. So let's look at what was in the journal. All of these women, there was no dog, by the way, on the island, as far as we know. All of these women were very upper class, not top of the line, but upper class, and fashionable. And they decided they'd go out there, but they were going to leave their day-to-day lives behind. And so, of course, King Richard's Fair is down in Carver now. People take different names, different identities. That's what they did back in 1891. So they called themselves different names. We had the autocrat, the artistic, the autocrat, the artist, the aristocrat, and the scribe. Only that instead of the, they said ye. So and they sometimes you'll see that kind of dialect in the journal. Well, we didn't have any idea who they were because they never referred to each other by their names. They were always by these labels. So they made entries in this journal. It's about an 8.5 by 11 journal every day, but they took turns. So there were 4 different handwritings in this book, which was an interesting challenge to try to decipher. The illustrations, we had watercolor sketches, We had photographs, diagrams of the cottage, pictures of the island itself, and quotes or sometimes misquotes from the poetry of the day. Well, they left Rose Wharf in Boston on July 17th, 1891. And according to their journal, it was 90 degrees in the shade. Now, mind you, they had come from Lowell by train to Rose Wharf. They got the ferry at the Rose Wharf terminal and went from there to Hull. They landed at Pemberton Pier, and when they got to Pemberton Pier, they took off their fancier clothes that they would use for traveling.
Hi, Marguerite. I was just going to ask, is there, I think your outer coat, every time you, is there a way to move the microphone to like?
Well, I can give it a try. I keep knocking it off. Is that any better?
Thank you. I was just noticing.
If it weren't for the microphone, I'd be projecting out like I had a high school class here. But
All right.
thank you, Brian. I appreciate
All
it.
right, you're welcome.
These are some of the sample pages from the journal. You can see they included, let's get that out of there. They included the photos, they included paintings, and labels on things. This is more that you'll see later on. This is the cottage they stayed in. They were able to borrow this cottage on the island from the uncle of one of the women. There was no electricity, of course. There was no running water. And the roof leaked, which they didn't find out until they got there. Nice cottage, though. It had a lovely porch, which they kept referring to as the piazza. And they just looked right out on the water. Gorgeous view. A hammock, a place to get out of the sun, get out of the rain. They documented everything about the trip. They took photos, they drew pictures. These are the floor plans of the two layers of the house. They looked like they were about 50 feet from the water, but there wasn't much of anything else in that area. On the other side of the island, there was a small fishing colony, but they weren't staying there permanently. They just did it in the summertime. This is the east room. As it turned out, this was the room where the roof leaked. And they had to rescue the bedding and even the journal from that room in a hurry. And the slide caption, which you may or may not be able to read, says, "Blessed be that spot where cheerful guests retire." This is the kitchen. Nice cast iron stove. Notice that there is no timer, no temperature indicator, but it did have the friendly tea kettle, which they all needed. They documented every meal. They noted the weather conditions each day. For example, on this day, and I didn't notice which day it was, for breakfast they had oatmeal, bacon, fried potatoes, corn cake, tea, and coffee. Pretty substantial. For lunch, they had crackers, sardines, cheese, and marmalade. And for dinner, they had fried pork and eggs, baked potatoes, and rice pudding. We noted that except for the potatoes, they didn't seem to have much in the way of vegetables or fruits in their menus. And I don't think they foraged for any veggies or fruits out there. Besides the food that they brought with them, they also received frequent deliveries from Boston, and occasional visitors brought special delicacies to share with the women, or they, in one case, some of their friends who belonged to the Boston Yacht Club went down to the fishing colony on the other side of the island and bought out all of the lobsters that one of the fishermen had and brought them back, and they cooked them on the beach and shared them. And then they left. Not bad. Eventually, they found an ice box on the piazza, and they were able to arrange for the deliveries of large blocks of ice to help keep their food cold. But in the interim, they put their perishables into the bucket of the well and lowered it in there to keep things cool. Mind you, it was 90 degrees in Boston. It was probably about 65 degrees out on the island. And they did note the weather every single day. The weather, whether it rained, what the tide was like, stuff of that sort. So, extending from Great Brewster back towards Boston is a sandbar that's called the Great Brewster Spit. So you're standing at the end of it, the Boston end of it, and looking back towards Great Brewster itself. And this is a photo that I think I took. A modern photograph of the Great Brewster Spit. Notice that the shape of the island is sort of like a whale. I did this program down at the Hull Life-Saving Museum one time. The door was open, and I was looking right at Great Brewster. I said, everybody turn around and look out there, because that's where you are. Until the fill from the Big Dig was added to Spectacle Island in the late 20th century, Great Brewster was the tallest island in the harbor. At the time the women were out there, Great Brewster was about 25 acres, and there's been significant erosion since. It's down to about 19 above the beach now. One of the occupants of the island was the Lady Brewster. So, of course, she had to be included. They painted, and they commented on Boston Light. They painted anything that caught their fancy out there. This is Boston Light at night. And the interesting thing about it is that Boston Light was really the only lighthouse at the entrance to the harbor at that time, because Graves Light, which is further north at the north entrance to the harbor, wasn't built until 1905. So if you go out there now, you'll see, or if you're flying over it, you'll see two lighthouses. This is the original one built in 1716. And part of the original 1716 tower is still there. Now here's a poem that they wrote, the women wrote, in the journal on July 20th. It gives you a sense of what it was like being on the island at night. How very silent is the sea tonight. The little waves climb up the shore and lay cool cheeks upon the ever-moving sands that follow swift their whispering retreat. I knew what things their busy tongues confess to earth. Pretty good. Now for comparison, this is an early 20th century postcard of Boston Light. And if you were to go out there now, this large house isn't there anymore. It used to be, it was a three-person, three-keeper station, and the keepers had their families with them. And they also had very large families. So that was a duplex house. This is the keeper's house, which still stands and is still used by the keeper today. This photo I took from Little Brewster, from Great Brewster Island, and that's the way it looks now at Boston Light, at Little Brewster. You'll notice that there's another sand spit running between the two. For the record, it is still possible at a full moon tide to walk across this spit from Little Brewster to Great Brewster, but it's very dicey footing, and you have to move fast because the tide comes in really fast. But I've done it. You're not supposed to. The first keeper of Boston Light was George Worthington, and he started his work in 1716. He worked at Little Brewster. He kept his flock of 59 sheep on Great Brewster because there was more land and more grazing. But he lived on Lovell's Island. Now, this isn't quite the Southeast Expressway for a commute, But it is subject to some of the same challenges that the expressway does with weather and water and all that stuff. Anyway, one day in 1717, his sheep wandered out onto the Great Brewster Spit on the other end of the island. Yeah, and the tide came in, and all 59 were drowned. Worthington, Worthy Lake was not totally out of resources. He worked for what was then the Great and General Court of Massachusetts, and he put in for reimbursement for the loss of his sheep. And he got it. He said he was busy doing his duty on Little Brewster, therefore he couldn't go and rescue his sheep, therefore they owed him. Another lighthouse in Boston Harbor is called Bug Light. Bug Light, not Bud Light. It's also known as the Narrows Light. Bug Light was the landward or western end of the Great Brewster Spit. And the women often walked out there at low tide. And it was a great view from there across to the other islands. The lighthouse that you see here burned down in 1929. The keeper was scraping paint, and he had a blowtorch in one hand, and he was scraping with the other hand. And then they put in a stone or a brick lighthouse, and that was replaced by a beacon that is currently there. It's an open triangular tower of steel, and you can still see it out there. I haven't walked out all the way on the Great Brewster Spit, but almost. But the tide caught me and I had to run back. So, the next thing was what was not in the journal. A little bit of context about who these women were, what kind of lives they lived, what happened, who owned what, and what happened after they left. And more importantly, since there were no names, we had to figure out who they were. So there were no names in the journal. They're just the adopted names. They never used their real names, and they used only these nicknames. So we have up here the autocrat of Great Brewster. We have the gentle aristocrat, the artistic acrobat, who was known to hop from rock to rock, and ye voracious scribe, busily writing the journal, her page of the journal. These women were all in their 40s when they went out there, so they were ready for a break. So we met by Zoom because of the pandemic and because also the geography. Some people were on the North Shore, some people were on the South Shore, some people were in Lowell. We started working on this project during the pandemic, and we gathered, after the book went to press, we gathered on Spectacle Island, and we remarked how much better we looked without the Zoom frames. So in August 2022, when the book went to press finally, the research team that co-authored the book gathered on Spectacle Island to celebrate the fact that the book had gone to press. Yes. And Suzanne Gallmarsh and Stephanie Chereau led the project, and we all were immensely grateful for their doing that, because Stephanie in particular, who is the titular author of the book, did all of the legwork of connecting with the publisher. And here we have who's who. Okay, Elizabeth Corella, who was an internationally known photographic expert and photographic history. Suzanne Gallmarsh, who is as I've said before, the founder of the Friends. We have Anne Marie Allen in disguise. And let's see, who else? Carol Fithian, who is visually handicapped and a fencing master. I don't know how she does it. Also behind her, we have, there's the mouse, Allison Andrews, Stephanie Sherrill, and somebody you might know. Not pictured, Walter Hope, Vivian Bart, Pam Indyk, and Martha Mayo. Well, how did we figure out who they were? We knew the identity of one of the women, Helen Augusta Whittier, because there was a note in the very back of the journal, and it said on the stationery from Charles B. Nichols, interesting account of visit to Great Brewster Island in Boston Harbor. The ladies were friends of my mother's. The scribe was Miss Helen Whittier. Well, that's a good start. First of all, we tried to transcribe and begin to annotate what we found. So we set up a spreadsheet on a Google Drive. And then we argued back and forth about what it was, initialing each. I think the picnic was from Somerville. No, I think it's actually from Lowell, something like that. And eventually resolved it as we went around. A lot of the times, sometimes you get a letter that's a capital L and it looks like something else, or it's a capital W and somebody says, no, it's an N. There was just one name that was mentioned in the journal and not one of the women that we couldn't figure out. So we set up the Google Drive and we had folders up and down the yin yang with the stuff in it so we could all look at them and see what was out there. And we cataloged everything we found. Oh, did we catalog everything? This article proved to be key because it was an article in the Boston Globe, and it was about the XV Club of Lowell. Now, at this time, there were a lot of small groups of women's clubs, and what they tried to do it was educational and discussion oriented. When they went to school in the 1860s, if any of the women were able to get an education at all, and these women were, education consisted of reading, memorization, and recitation. There was no discussion. There was no, and for the most part, no creative writing and stuff like that. Anybody who did that did it on their own. So the clubs set up discussions about, this started off as a Dickens club. They started working on the works of Charles Dickens, who visited Lowell, and they went on to other writers and kept this discussion thing. Well, this was a common thing around in Massachusetts and other states, and eventually led to the formation of the Massachusetts Women's Club, and then eventually the National Women's Club. So it was really pretty good. But this article actually listed the members of the club. So it narrowed down the number of guesses we had to about 15. All of the women were originally from Lowell. This is one of the mills in Lowell. And two of the women were quite proficient artists. Their initials on some of the paintings were useful. You can barely see them, but this initials BC, HAW, and, excuse me, another BC up there. The artistic acrobat, Bella Coburn, was one of the women. She too was an accomplished artist. Her parents were Franklin Coburn, who worked as a clerk in his brother's West Indies goods store, and Hannah Estes Phelps. Bella went to LaSalle Seminary, now LaSalle University, and she also taught art there. She never married, but she and Helen Augusta Whittier had their work exhibited in Philadelphia at the Centennial Exhibition of the United States. So they were chosen to represent that. The autocrat of the great Brewster, Helen Frances Ray French, was a member of a notable Lowell family and a member of the XV Club. In 1869, at age 26, Helen married Josiah Bowers French Jr., the son of the bank president and Lowell Mayor Josiah Bowers French Sr. So there was a little money there. Ye gentle aristocrat, Sarah Elizabeth Lizzie Dean Adams. She was niece of Benjamin Dean, a man active in local, state, and national politics, who likely influenced the Trippers' choice of the great Brewster for their retreat. In fact, we think he owned the cottage. Why he never repaired the roof, I don't know. Anyway, Lizzie Dean married Landon S. Adams, paymaster for over 30 years at the Lowell Manufacturing Company. Her uncle, Benjamin Dean, was an important figure in Massachusetts politics and the life of Boston Harbor Islands. Raised in Lowell, Benjamin later moved to Boston, where he was a prominent attorney and later a U.S. representative in Congress. He owned Outer Brewster Island, so the one that's even further out, and was one of the founders of the Boston Yacht Club. Ye voracious scribe, Helen Augusta Whittier, really interesting character, and one that we were able to find out a lot about. She owned and operated the Whittier Cotton Mill in Lowell. She owned it, her father founded it. When the father died, her brother took it over. When the brother died, Helen took it over. And when Helen bailed out of it during the recession, the Panic of 1893, her cousin took it over. Yeah, keeping it all in the family. What they made at the mill was they took the raw cotton and they spun it into thread and fibers, and then they sold that to the other mills like down in Fall River and the other Lowell. Lowell was cotton mills. Lawrence was woolen mills. And a lot of the workers there were women who came down from Canada for the winter. And they stayed in Lowell because they could work and get money. And then in the summertime, they'd go north. One of the problems of working in the mills in the summertime was that in order to keep the humidity level high so that the fibers that were flying through the air didn't explode, they nailed the windows shut. If you ever get a chance to go to the Lowell National and State Historical Park, go. It's great fun, and you learn a lot. And they actually have the mills and the looms working and the spinning things, and they have a boat that goes around. You can take a train, a trolley car, and a boat, and travel around the whole park. Great fun. And if you don't get to do that, and you want to stay local, the UMass Boston Open Archives has a section devoted to Lowell, not just historical Lowell, but current Lowell. And you can see the progression through it. If you're interested, talk to me later. I'll give you the URL. But it's free. It's open to you. And let's see, Helen Augusta Whittier. As I said, her artwork, which was painted pottery, at this time was in Philadelphia at the Centennial Exhibition, and her art contributions in the journal are identified by her initials, HAW. I've related to the painted pottery because my great-grandmother did the same thing at about the same time at another little group at that time in Brighton. So it was really pretty cool. She was an art teacher, a photographer, an avid promoter of women's clubs, and an entrepreneur who helped manage and at one time owned the Whittier Mills in Lowell, including the expansion of a mill in Atlanta. She co-founded the XV Club, the 15, so-called because there were 15 members. It was limited to 15 members. There were other women's clubs at the time in Lowell, but everybody wanted to be in the XV Club. In 1893, Whittier suffered some kind of financial blow, possibly the Panic of 1893. And so at age 47, she said she began to earn her living. The president of the Middlesex Women's Club from 1897 to 1900, she was later a member of the New England Women's Club and dedicated herself to engaging the women of New England in learning and discussion. The club held debates, classes on specific topics, lectures, activities, and informal gatherings by the members. Committees on different subjects led activities, as well as charitable and social reform efforts. The New England Women's Club still has an office in downtown Boston. In 1893, as I said, in 1903, she represented the Massachusetts delegation at the St. Louis World's Fair for Art Loan. This is the Whittier Cotton Mill Company's factory on Stackpole Street in Lowell. It was originally constructed in 1879 and relied on steam power, not just the water power from the Merrimack River, to power its carding and spinning machinery. This building still stands, and it's now used as residences by the Lowell Housing Authority. Let's go here. Good. So, we began to identify the different handwritings. You can see a sample of how different they are. The next slide identifies the individual writers of the 4 sample pages. The first one is by Helen Augusta Whittier, the scribe. The second one is by the aristocrat, Lizzie Dean. The third one is by our artistic acrobat. And we knew that because there was a reference to acrobatic verse at the beginning. I don't know what acrobatic verse is, and I was an English teacher, so I mean, you got to get a little slant there. And then the last one is by Helen Ray. And she's the only one that uses the I protein and pronoun, hello, and refers to the scribe as, and the aristocrat. So she refers to the others. Apparently they took turns on the 4-day cycle. The content also led us to match the names and to the handwriting. And there was a birthday story that matched the journal date to the birthday of the autocrat. So the watercolor on the last page with HAW's signature and the handwritten text also helped. These handwriting examples from 4 consecutive pages of the journal illustrate how distinctive the styles were, and that helped us identify who wrote what in the entire journal. And there we are. You gonna work for me, mouse? No, of course not. Okay, what did they do? What did they eat? Another menu: cold corned beef, bread and butter, tea, Rochester jelly cake, and cheese. Now, Rochester jelly cake, because it was a cake, and you saw what the kitchen looked like, right? We figured this was something they brought with them. And so I started researching, and I found 2 recipes for Rochester jelly cake online. So for our gathering on Spectacle Island, I made it. It was good. One layer is a plain butter cake. The second layer is a fruit cake. And in between the two is raspberry jelly. Not raspberry jam, raspberry jelly, because you didn't want the seeds. Right? And then put a little powdered sugar on the top, stuffed the whole thing into my backpack, and it was still good. You got to be careful, though, when you're doing things like that. One recipe called for 6 layers. I went, no way. The writers often quoted, and sometimes misquoted from memory, famous works with which they were familiar that were related to what they were seeing. So they talk about a winter fireside dream of dawns and sunsets by the summer sea from Whittier. And the next one, Lucy Larcom was a mill girl at one point. She started writing poetry. She got some of it published. John Greenleaf Whittier, who was not related to Helen, saw it and promoted her as a poet. She eventually became a college professor down at Wheaton College in Norton. And she's had 2 different sessions down there. So she was quite an interesting person. The vessels are sunk in the mist and hissed. Through the veil of the air throbs a sound like a wall of despair, like a wail of despair that dies into stillness profound. And once they were living on the island, a small green island, it seemed no more. And finally, one from Elizabeth Barrett Browning. My dream is of an island place which distant seas keep lonely. A little island on whose face the stars are watchers only. And they remembered all this stuff. This is not from a book. This is not from their memories. And sometimes they misquoted it, but hey, you know. So, the cameras and the photos. Elizabeth Carella, a photo historian, analyzed the photos and used Photoshop to enhance them so they were a little bit better contrast. Two types of cameras were used, she says. The round images, like this one, were made with one of the earliest Kodak cameras, the number 2, and it took round images. The later ones were from the Kodak number 3, which was produced rectangular images. So once they had finished the 100 shots of film, they would send the camera back to Kodak in Rochester and get back the prints and the camera reloaded with another 100 shots. One of the big things about this is that they were some of the first cameras that were intended for amateurs, that you didn't have to have a tripod and a big long lens and throw the black cloth over your head so you could see it. These were things that were portable, that anybody could use. And this was a real revelation. As a photographer myself, I do have a box camera, but it wasn't mine originally. I can really relate to this. So here's one of the rectangular photos. And this is the Kodak number 3 from about 1890 or thereabouts. And it also could be loaded in subdued light, but they weren't going to be loading their stuff. One of the big things is you didn't need a darkroom to load your film or to develop your prints. You could just send it back to Kodak. Many of the Kodak ads were directed at women. The key fact is that these were film cameras that didn't use the glass plate negatives. And it was much lighter weight. And they didn't have a darkroom. They didn't have to have a darkroom to see the results. In high school, we had, in the photography club, we had a classic speed graphic camera. And you had to load the sheet film into the little holders and then put the slide over it. And when we had an assignment, we lugged the thing home. It weighed a ton. I lived 1.9 miles from school, couldn't get a bus. And we only had one car in the family and my dad had it, so that was it. So I could really relate to this. The company's marketing slogan is wonderful. It was aimed at Kodakers, and it just said, "You press the button and we do the rest." That was a fantastic marketing thing. And the little picture on the corner says, "Oh, isn't it lovely? I must have a Kodak." This is the way they would have dressed. This would be their everyday costume on the left. And this was their relaxed costume. In the 19th century, too, actually I wondered whether they took their corsets off when they changed, but that was another story. Captain Thomas Captain Thomas Bates was their neighbor. He was the keeper of Boston Light. And one of the social amenities was that people would come and call on their neighbors. Well, the fact that there's, you know, a half a mile of water between you and your neighbor doesn't really matter if you have a boat. So Captain Thomas Bates and his little grandson came over in a boat and made us a call as our nearest neighbor. It was quite entertaining for half an hour. I looked up a little bit more about Captain Bates. Everybody said he was a great host, and people would come over to the light. They'd have a good time. They'd have a party, and then they'd go home, which was cool. So the result of all of this was the book. Ta-da. Oh, there's a couple of things I meant to read to you. And I've lost it. You know, I commented on their food. Hang on. This is some of the young men who came out to visit. The young men went down to William's Humble Cat. William was one of the fishermen who ferried them back and forth, and bought up all of his lobsters, built a fire on the beach and boiled them, bringing 5 of them up to us. We had the pleasure of eating them hot for lunch. When Mr. Waldrop was chatting with us on the piazza, and one of the local showers came our way, and great activity ensued on the part of the acrobat, who, after rescuing the log and other important papers from a shower bath in the vestibule, discovered several streams of water pouring through the roof of the east room, which necessitated the use of all available crockery in catching the water and the stripping and drying of the aristocrats' bedding. This episode was soon over, however, and benefited us by giving us a tub full of soft water, besides almost filling our water barrel. At about 3 p.m., Mr. Wardrop and his friends left, having taken our mail and some commissions for the larder. We then took up Kenilworth, which is a Sir Walter Scott book, and read aloud till dinner time, when we heartily enjoyed the Calf Island chicken, which William brought to us with the milk last night. So they were getting supplies from time to time. They were writing letters copiously, and they relied on some of these people who were dropping by to actually deliver the letters, take them to Boston to be mailed, and to bring letters for them back from Boston. And have I lost the other one? No, it's got to be here. Our letters were ready at 5 o'clock for the government workmen working on that seawall to mail. After dinner, the aristocrat and the autocrat, with much preparation of rubbers, old skirts, pails, and spoons, went forth to dig clams for food for tomorrow. The scribe and the acrobat were left to wash dishes, then to meet the other party at the northern end of the aisle to assist in bringing home the clams. With regret, they left a ruddy sunset and soon found their friends with light pails, cut hands, long faces, but no clams. So anyway, our book was published by the History Press on June 5th of this year, and obviously we were very excited. This is what is in the book, the table of contents. A lot of it is what we found out about the background and sort of notes on each of the journal entries to explain things like Halma, the game, and things that wouldn't necessarily be obvious. Something about Lowell, which was called the Spindle City. Quite a bit about Helen Augusta Whittier, why Great Brewster, and a little bit about the early history of the island. Impressions from the Great Brewster Journal photographs. So we were analyzing the photos as to what was in them and who might have taken them and so forth. Then we get down to the log of the square party, which they called themselves because there were 4 people, 4 sides to the square, at Great Brewster in ye pleasant month of July, 1891, 132 years ago. And then what has happened to Great Brewster since? A bit of an epilogue, which includes a little piece that I wrote when I was available to go out and volunteer on the islands, be an interpreter and so forth. I would go out there and I would keep my own journal. I didn't know anything about this journal, but whenever I go on a backpacking trip or something of that sort, I always keep a little journal. And so there's this little chunk of one of my journal entries in there. In 1891, they had their shared journal. In 1990, 99 years later, imagine, I had kept this little record of what we ate, what the temperature was like, just like I did, which is quite remarkable, and included pictures, photographs. So I had photos on one side and the text on the other, and came across it and said, gee, you know, that really fits in. Also, what has happened since then during World War I, the period between the wars, World War II, and the status of things now. Up until 1996, you could get a ferry from Boston out to Great Brewster Island. But the winter of 1996 destroyed the pier, and they never rebuilt it. But if you have your own boat, you can go out there and walk around. You can go to any of the islands, for that matter, and just see what it's like out there. It's very different from what the women saw. The well has disappeared. I think the Army took care of that. There are some military fortifications out there, which are very handy if it happens to pour. You got a place to stay a little dry. Wonderful views. You can climb to the top of the tallest hill and see all around. It's just a beautiful sight. And you can also see the lights and the boats going back and forth. And when we were camping out there, we used to sometimes hear the booze cruises going by. I mean, sometimes we used to hear them. The booze cruises going by. There's one, July 24th, 1891. Our melancholy friend, the foghorn, sounded through our morning dreams, but when we roused ourselves and gazed from our chamber window into, quote, the ever-silent spaces of the east, far-folded mists and gleaming halls of morn, we found that the sun was triumphing over the fog, and the day proved to be most gloriously clear and beautiful. They also mentioned that one of the things that intrigued them was in the evening, the beacon of Boston Light would sweep over the island, as it still does. And at the point of sunset, the cannons at George's Island, which was across the Narrows there, would fire the sunset salute. And to this day, not George's Island, but the U.S. Constitution, USS Constitution, does the same thing. In fact, if you're down on the waterfront on the Boston side, you can hear it. It can be quite startling, because it's a very loud report. But it's something that is part of our heritage, and it's so accessible to us. You don't have to be out on the islands. You know, you can go there and go down to Charlestown and hear the guns fire, stuff like that. So very, very fun kind of thing. Well, this is the celebration that we had out on Spectacle Island, and there's the Rochester jelly cake. I know you had to see that one.
Looks good.
Thank you. It was very good. And the recipe is in the book. Now that stove, as I said, had no temperature regulation. You know, you put your hand in. If you can hold it for 10 seconds, it's not hot enough yet. I put in the temperature, 350, and then the timing which depends on, of course, the size of the pan you're using and all that stuff. But something that if you really want to make it, do it. But use the raspberry jelly, not the raspberry jam. Available at your local supermarket. So, you can buy the book online at Amazon and on the online booksellers and various stores around. I have a list of them over there. If you buy the book tonight, you get a discount. It's usually lists for $25.50, discounted for a member of the Friends of the Boston Harbor Islands. But for tonight, I talked them into letting me sell it for $20 a pop. And you got it. Way to go, Lee. And I'm very happy to do it, and I'll be happy to autograph any copies. I have one thing to leave you with, and that is this. I wrote the 100th and the 125th anniversary Centennial Chronicle and the 150th anniversary chronicle that was published in the Norwood Messenger. And one line I used in there that I would remind you of: we are all making history every day. So thank you. Any questions about it? Whoa, okay.
Just a quick question. One time, one of my sisters had done some research on an island in the Boston Harbor where if people were sick. So at one time, she found that there was a cholera epidemic.
Yes.
And we had and going way back, an uncle and a young child were sent out to the island. Do you know what time period that would have been and what island it happened?
Anywhere from the 1700s through the 1930s. As to which island, it would depend on the time. The Deer Island was used as basically a concentration camp for Native Americans. It was also a location for a quarantine station. There's another one. Long Island was the hospital. I'm stuck for the name right at the moment because I never really liked the island myself. Rainsford, yes. Rainsford had several things. It had a hospital for children from Boston. There was a doctor out there who started a clinic and felt if he could get the children out of the city air, which at that time was pretty awful, they would get healthier, and many of them did. It had also been used, again, as a quarantine station. Sometimes there were quarantine stations established on the islands for the immigrants coming into Boston. They would check the ships before they were allowed to land, and they sort them out, and some went to the quarantine areas. Some of them died there. And I think it's Rainsford. And I know Thompson's Island is a cemetery on each of them. So the Thompson Island Cemetery is different. They had the Thompson Academy there, and one time a group of the students and an instructor went out on a boat, and they were coming back from someplace and ran into a storm, got swamped, and they all drowned. They rescued the bodies and put them in the cemetery on Thompson. Typically, Thompson is one of the places that the Friends of the Harbor Islands go on January 1st. Because it has a place where you can go in and get warm, which is nice. Yeah, there's lots of different uses for the different islands. On how am I doing time-wise? Okay, we got a little time. George's Island. Edgar Allan Poe, when he was in the Army, was stationed out there. And he heard a legend. The legend was that one Christmas they gave leaves to most of the officers and men out there, but there was a group of 4 that were stuck there. And they were, playing cards and gambling and drinking and so forth. And they thought one of them was cheating. So they figured they'd get him. Well, they were playing cards again the next night. They got him thoroughly drunk. And they said, you know, there's a bottle of a really good wine. In fact, there's a whole cask of it, and it's hidden in one of the cells. Let's go find it. So they set off. And God kept saying, gee, it's awful dark in here. They gave him a torch, and still wasn't very good. And they said, oh, just keep going, you'll find it. Just keep going. You know, you're the smallest one, you can do it. So they sent him in. And he was so drunk, he just fell over. Right? Then they quickly bricked him in.
Oh my goodness.
Okay? Do you ever read the story of the cask of Amontillado?
Yes.
Yeah. Poe heard this story, translated it to another time and place, and had his short story. Well, there's another little tick on this thing, and that is that years later, when they were doing some renovations in the fort, found this wall where there wasn't supposed to be one. There was supposed to be a doorway there, and they broke through it, and they found a skeleton. If you go out to George's Island, which is fairly easy, bring a flashlight.
And don't cheat at poker.
Yeah, don't cheat at poker. Don't drink. Yes.
Was there a dog out there? I noticed the dog.
No, there was no dog.
Oh.
That was just artistic license. They probably wish there was a dog out there by that time, but and I don't think they had the same problem with ticks that we have. But it was, yeah, if you do go out there, you know, take precautions.
Was the cask of wine in the cell?
You know, they didn't say in the report. They just said it was enough they found the skeleton. So that was good stuff. Okay, yes.
Were any of the letters that were sent off the island ever traced back anywhere or discovered anywhere?
I don't know. It wasn't included in the Schlesinger archive. And, you know, even at that, we were darn lucky we found out what we did. People also ask me if, were the women married? 2 of them were, 2 of them weren't. And then, of course, the inevitable question is, why not? Well, when you think about these women were born in the 1840s, and about the time that they reached what would have been considered marriageable age in about the 1860s, there was a little thing called a Civil War, which removed a significant part of the male population. Now, I think Helen Whittier was, frankly, married to the mill. This was the family project, and she took it upon herself to run it. She was, after she stopped being involved with it, she got very involved in various other things. She did a lot of traveling. She was a suffragette. She did extended the women's club's ideas, and her obit is in the book. Everybody said she was a wonderful person. They all loved her. And you think somebody was that driven, you know, might not be, but she was very much respected.
Yeah, I noticed that one of the women died 4 years after
Yeah.
the outing.
Yeah.
Was that from the
Doesn't seem to have been related at all to this. It was just, you know, mortality was pretty heavy in those days.
Women did not swim at that time. Is that coming in the 1900s?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Women swimming?
There's a picture in the book of the women wading with their skirts tucked up, and their bathing costumes, as they call them, were often made of wool, were long. They had long pants on them, skirts, and of course were totally covered on top, including their arms. And I can, the mere thought of trying to swim in something like that would be, yeah. My mother used to tell a story about some friends of her aunt's. So you're still in that, you know, late 20s, teens and 20s period. The bathing suits were made of wool. And there's two stories. One is the bathing suits were made of wool, and if you took them out of this woman had taken her bathing suit out of the drawer in the summertime and put it on. They went to the beach, they were playing. And one of the things they were doing was filling each other's bathing suits with sand, which of course exacerbated the mothholes. And she went into the water and didn't want to come out. And then there was another one, which was even earlier, where a friend of theirs was arrested for walking across the street in her bathing costume. Heavens. So, I mean, I think we've come a long way. Yes?
Do we know how they knew each other?
Yeah, they knew each other. They were all members of the XV Club in Lowell. And their community was pretty tight. So, yeah.
Does the XB stand for something?
It stands for 15. It's Roman numeral 15.
Roman numerals.
Yeah. Just to make it a little bit, you know, more obvious. Yeah.
Did they all work in the mills at one time? besides
No,
the-
they are different things.
That's where I figured they probably met.
Yeah,
you know.
well, they met sort of on the social level rather than on the professional level. Helen Whittier ran the mill. Lucy Larkham, whose work I mentioned earlier, was a mill girl. The conditions were pretty tough, but the Canadian women who came down for the winter were a lot warmer in the mills than they would have been up in Canada on the farm, and they went home in the summertime to work the farm and do the family business. But Helen was the only one directly associated with the mills in Lowell. One of the people who worked on this is a Lowell historian from University of Massachusetts at Lowell, and she did a phenomenal amount of work. It was just like one of those, Martha, what about? And she had so much information. It was just mind-boggling. In fact, the intellectual capabilities of this group just blow me away. I just, oh really? You know, so good. Yeah.
Is the cottage still there?
No. During, well, World War I, when the Army took it over, and World War II, the Army just said, okay, that's it. And between the wars, there were people from the South Shore who would come over, and they had their little cottages and so forth. And if you are interested in learning more about them, there's, again, UMass Boston has an archive called the Island Voices Project. And we were able to go out to Great Brewster one lovely day, and these people came up and they recorded their stories. Some of them brought pictures, but a lot of them just talked. And these were usually people in their 60s, 70s, and I wasn't at that age. But it was a fascinating collection of information, and that too is publicly accessible through UMass. So if you go out to the, I don't know if it's in the open archives, but just search the UMass Boston website, umb.edu. You can find it out there, and pictures and stories. Brian.
You mentioned you couldn't figure out who owned the cottage. Did they know who owned the land or the plot?
Well, no, that's an interesting question. It's being debated to this day. Depends on the time period. Benjamin Dean owned. Oh, good. It did what it was supposed to do. All evening during the Trails Committee meeting that preceded this, I was running up and joggling the mouse so that it wouldn't do that. Anyway, some of the islands were owned by the city of Boston. Some were the town of Hull. Some by the U.S. government. And depending on the time period, Benjamin Dean bought the island. Originally, going back to colonial days, they were granted to various people. And then after that, the properties were sold. And then came a period when there was some dispute about which town had the property. And even now, when they were rehabbing Graves Light, the town of Hull said, no, this is our property. The city of Boston said, no, it's our property. And the US government said, stuff it sideways, guys, it's our property. So anyway, Dave Waller, who's the guy who now owns the lighthouse, I don't know whether he owns the land, but there isn't much land out there. It's all rock and it's broken up. Said, I'm not paying taxes to any of you guys because I don't have to. So yeah, there's more stories I could tell you about the other islands out there, but there are fun things about there, the stories of the different islands and who's doing what where.
Someone did buy Graves Lighthouse.
Yes,
Right?
Dave Waller.
Just do it. Yeah.
And he's out
He
there.
doesn't own the island, just the
Well, I don't know. As I say, the town of Hull said they owned it and he owed them taxes.
Yeah.
But then, is it in their jurisdiction? The government says no. More power to him. Dave runs a neon sign business in Malden, and he and his wife, who is a professional illustrator, rehabbed a fire station in Malden, and they live there. So, I mean, they're really into this rehab thing. And if you get a cruise out, and they're still running the cruises, take a cruise out, goes, they call it Lighthouse Cruise.
Yeah.
It goes by all of the lighthouses in Boston Harbor. It goes by Graves Light, Boston Light, and you will probably see them out there working on it. In fact, I've got a lot of pictures of them out there. And also look for the seals. There are gray seals out there, not the smaller harbor seals, like you see at the aquarium, but gray seals. And the gray seals have heads about as big as a basketball, and they pop up and then they disappear, and then they pop up over there. It's always fun to see. So I do encourage you to go out. Yes?
Did you say that they were only there for 2 weeks once? Sounds like they did a lot in that 2 weeks.
They certainly crammed a lot into the 17 days that they were out there. July 17th to July 31st. And it was interesting to read about their reentry and how they thought that this dream of an idyllic island would be something they would be talking about over the fireside in the wintertime. And it's a nice way to end it. So, great. Well, thank you all for coming.